Thanks, Craig, and thanks to the organising committee for the invitation today. Obviously, we've come off a wet year, and it's quite topical about what we can do to try and mitigate, the risk of waterlogging in paddocks that are, prone to that issue. And as a side, we see waterlogging effects, not just in high rainfall zone, right from Queensland right through to Tasmania. It's a common issue that we see. It's just often not addressed, or it's considered, at a level that's not worth in any investment in managing. Yeah, hopefully today I can show you some simple tools that can be used to, implement some strategies to just mitigate that effect where it is potentially likely to occur. I put this up. This is the typical precision ag cycle we take with any solution we try and deliver for a customer. And I think for me, this holds the key to the adoption of precision ag, generally speaking. And drainage is a good example where we can't just be spinning that data cycle and not really having any focus of what we're trying to achieve at farm level. And so it's about having a targeted constraint, identifying what data do we need to fix this issue, what intelligence and processes do we need to go through to analyse it, and often that's in partnership between our business and the agronomists that we work with to ultimately deliver an action. And until we get an action, there's no value realised in any of this, and therefore there'll be no reinvestment in precision ag. And so that's where I think there's a real failing, generally speaking, is between taking it from data right through to an action in the field. And drainage is just a nice example where we've identified there's an issue. It's quite visual, we know that. And the action of getting right through to putting a scraper or a grader or raised beds or whatever it might be into a paddock to have a genuine solution and action. There's a whole range of sort of layers to the whole range, I think, of opportunities with precision ag, which focus on. But there's two aspects, I think. One's input use efficiency, and that's where you're typically trying to sharpen fertiliser applications. And right through to yield unlock. And I think drainage is one of those things where, if it's a constraint that occurs on your farm, then it's something, we would view that as a yield unlock program where we can put some steps in place to mitigate that. So we start with the data, and I'll talk about this. EM38 and elevation are very common data sets that you're aware of. The elevation data may come from the farmer's RTK, or it may be something you have to go into the paddock and acquire. And wet season NDVI, a really good spatial record of identifying where the effects of waterlogging has occurred. Couple those together and you can start to really build an accurate plan for a farm. But also, we like to feed in some strategic soil samples in there, not just for dispersion and exchangeable sodium levels, but I think that fits into a whole range of other nutrition programs as well, which I'll touch on briefly. And then we get to the actions, that's ultimately putting in some drains or variable rate gypsum to try. It's all about, obviously, it's about trying to minimise the concentration of water in a paddock. And so it's about healthy soils, improving infiltration rate, and then using drains to try and control water movement across paddocks. And I truly believe that certainly in our environment where we're farming, our biggest opportunity is capturing the upside in those wet years. If we can harness that and convert those high rainfall seasons into big yields like last year, then I think our business is in good shape, because at the same time we're implementing all the healthy soil strategies and minimum tillage and stubble retention to try and manage dry seasons, but often we tend to forget these wetter years and how we can still maximise benefits in those years. So I think that's where we can often make our real money in those seasons. Satellite imagery, you've probably all seen it. There's no real tricks to it. It's a good, robust guide to biomass. In this particular image here, red is low, blue is high. Whole farm imagery, low cost sort of options can give you a really good guide of where the water's sat across the farm, and can start just a good picture to start visualising, quantifying the extent of areas. It's often surprising. People say, well, I knew it was wet anyway. But if you go down get it into a spatial mapping program and measure the exact area and say, well, actually that paddock, it wasn't just that little wet patch through there, it added up to be 12% of the paddock. and the cost was X. Allows you to do some of those numbers. You've got that forever. It's a record that you can compare in other years, and so it's always good from other programs of trying to define management zones to look at how does your farm perform in wet years and dry years. So it's good to add to your library, as I mentioned, quantifying. And then ultimately we start overlaying that with other elevation data sets to really get into some design steps. EM38 is another application which is not, obviously it's not critical for just designing where drains need to go, but I think it's a really nice data set that can complement the thinking, which integrates, soil type variability as well as, slope and obvious movement across paddocks based on elevation. So we like it because we can then come into a paddock, do some soil testing and get a feel for, what sort of, in particular, dispersive nature and exchangeable sodium levels are in those areas and start thinking about some gypsum programs. So from that you can see we can also do a drainage plan of where these drains may go, and a big part of that is thinking about AB lines as well. And not many people like changing AB lines, and certainly not many like having multiple in paddocks, but if in certain paddocks, if waterlogging is a really big issue, you may need to even give up some operational efficiency and maybe you may have to move away from being along the longest run and change your direction of run, maybe even having two different directions in a paddock to manage water. It's just a critical part of the design that people often forget, and they'll just put a drain in and not realise that the way, particularly in time machines, it has a massive bearing on how water moves across paddock, and you can really work in with your drains to draw water into your drains and then carry them out safely. The soil testing, I've spoken about this. I really think it's a good just baseline data set as well, and there's a whole range of measurements up there that you can see, which are relatively stable type measurements that once you've got it, you kind of only sort of need it once, or perhaps only every third or fourth soil testing cycle that you might go through on the farm. And it just sets up the basic understanding of your soil parameters in a paddock for a whole range of programs. And today I'm talking about the drains, but particularly about phosphorus and nitrogen as well with your PBIs and organic carbon levels. So for me, that's almost like a starting point of just understanding paddocks. And as we know, there's a heap of commercial operators out there that can collect this data at not a lot of cost, and as a one-off investment to understand paddocks, I really do support that as a good base data set. And then obviously, going with the sampling equipment. And I've put that slot in there just to talk about going down the profile. We do a lot of surface testing. I think, if you're going to go to the effort of doing that, get an intact core and have a look down the profile as well and start thinking about, those next depths. We've had some fantastic work done with Southern Farming Systems and Lisa Miller looking at pH down the profile, and I think it's just started to get us all to start thinking beyond just the 0 to 10 test and going down to that next level, and whether they're 10 centimetre increments or along your different horizons of your soil. But I think investing in understanding your soils and doing some of these cores fits in nicely to a whole range of programs, including, for today's topic, gypsum application. And just on the gypsum, I'd say I honestly think there's a real research need to better understand the economics to gypsum in these different profiles, because we might do a 0 to 10 and we might be okay, we might have a lot of textured topsoil, but then we come into some, obviously where we are, we have a lot of sodic subsoils, and depth of working of effectiveness of gypsum and rates and ultimate rates, and I speak to lots of different agronomists and I get lots of different answers of how they come up with application rates, and I've looked for a lot of calculators and I don't see a lot of really good tools out there to help us be scientific about how we're determining a gypsum rate, rather than just, we put a tonne to the acre out because that's a gypsum, that's a soil repair rate that we use. I think we need to do better than that, and I just say that I think there's a knowledge gap just on that particular topic. Another example here of overlaying data sets. This is a yield map with some contour lines, and this is the property where I'm farming, and we used to get smashed with waterlogging every year. It would come off those rocky rises, so these are non-arable areas, rocky rises. We had a really bad ryegrass through there. Just put in that very shallow spoon drain. It's like a curved drain. The next picture that shows it, so this was from last year. You can see we still farm right through it. Most of the drains we're talking about putting in are just shallow spoon drains that you can still farm through. And you know, that's changed that area. So it's about a 3 hectare area south of that drain where we were affected by ryegrass, and some years we would get no crop off that at all. We put those drain in 3 years ago, and you know, have completely solved that issue. And you know, the cost was probably $200 worth of excavator work, and so I just think there's simple strategies that we're talking about doing here. It's not rocket science, and it doesn't really affect. You know, we farm through it. Yeah, we slow down a little bit when we go and spray through it, but it doesn't really affect us too much. So I think it's a common sense sort of approach. This is another paddock, again showing those different data sets. So we've got the elevation map over here, you can see. So this is a paddock coming out of pasture. We're going to crop it this year. So we'll just put one drain through here. We've set our A/B line along here. So we'll feed water down into this drain, run it down through, out into a table drain and down into a creek. This area through here is it's essentially like a swamp at the moment, really very poor productive pasture. And you know, in country where we should be able to, you know, grow, you know, 5 to 8 tonne cereal crops, it's just an absolute waste. And if we don't put that drain there, it'll continue to be like that. We've also got the EM38 data set just to understand soil type changes across that paddock. Again, coming out of pasture, I've got no spatial measurements of performance of that paddock, so yield maps or NDVI. So, you know, we've come in there and we've identified some different zones and got some very crude gypsum rates to go out in the next 6 weeks. And so we've got this sort of swampy area, which is slightly heavier textured, but it's been wet for most of its life. You know, we need to try and bring that back to life. And then we've got some genuinely quite heavy soil further up in the profile, and then 2 other transitional soils. So, you know, that's the type of program we're trying to implement, and it's very basic, but there's still, you know, I'm really uncomfortable about how we come up with these rates, as I mentioned earlier. But I still, you know, I think there's still value in going with just some estimates of what we're doing, because, you know, essentially that's what everyone's doing, really, from what I can see. Another example, case study of a farmer further over near Lake Bolac. So a whole farm, again, NDVI in the background, blue is high, red is low, showing where waterlogging was in effect for this last season. We've got some existing drains. You can see the legend there. So some existing drains through the property, and then sitting down and identifying. Firstly, you know, where are the ridge lines? What direction of run do we take? Do we need to intercept some drains? And then where can we safely deposit water? They've got some swamps where we can put some water on. There's 2 points on that map where we are going to be putting water onto a neighbour's property, and so absolutely critical that you've got to go and speak to those neighbours and make sure they're happy for that, and ideally connect that up and get it into a safe water point. Legislation on where you can put drains in varies depending on where you are. So, you know, I encourage you to speak to your local governments and find out, you know, in your area what you need to do, because permits are sometimes required, and certainly there's legislation to protect a neighbour from getting flooded out. So you can't just go and drop a heap of water onto the neighbouring property. So I think it's just part of that sort of whole catchment, and ideally, you know, communication's the key on that. And we've never hit an issue. Often the water's going there anyway. One thing to say is you can't change where water ultimately ends up. You can't put water into a different catchment. So essentially the water's still leaving the property at the same point. Yes, it may move off a bit quicker, so that's something to be aware of. And we saw that with the raised bed experience, where we've increased the rate of water coming off paddocks, and that can cause issues. One of the obvious issue could be if you're putting water, if it's always gone onto a road, and you're now increasing the rate, and you get a heavy rainfall event, and it starts flooding a road, which has never flooded before, and locals are driving on that road, and they hit water at night, an aquaplane, have an accident. You know, that's worst case scenario. But that's why we do need to have there's some really serious implications of doing this sort of work, and so again, it's just about being sensible. And if it's a large amount of area, you may need to look at some buffer dams, to slow that rate down to really protect, the whole community. We've also got another gypsum program there, you can see, based on the EM38, farmers' knowledge, agronomists' knowledge, and those soil tests that they've been doing. So my final slide is that, I think it's a combination of looking at both the gypsum and the drains. Obviously, it's also about time of sowing and nitrogen and all those other things, but having that whole farm, or a bit more of a holistic approach to managing water, not just about one or the other. I think, speaking to people over the last few years, I think there's greater awareness of, the role of gypsum in improving water infiltration and managing, the effect of waterlogging. And, we've been doing it, very rate gypsum for the last few years, and it's made an enormous difference. There was one paddock where we would lose 15% of the paddock every year just about to waterlogging, and through a few drains and some relatively heavy rates of gypsum, we haven't had any. We've essentially got rid of all that waterlogging effect completely. We're down to, negligible levels, and I'm convinced it's to do with water's just not running off like it used to. There's obviously those key data sets, as I've mentioned, that we need, and my whole approach to farming is that we want to be making informed decisions and evidence-based decisions, and this is just another example of we've just got to compile this information and make sure it goes through to an action and get a result. And when we have that general thinking, I think the whole discussion around precision ag and data will improve, because at the moment often it's just spinning. It's data for data's sake, but it has to be part of what are the actions, what are the constraints on your farm that you want to improve and unlock yield potential. And then finally, you move into your paddock plan, which, as I said a few times, direction of run is another, it's an important part of it, and being flexible and willing to change your direction of run. Because we've done jobs where that's all we've had to do, change the direction of run, no drains required, and it's eliminated the effect of waterlogging on that paddock. So really important part of the design program, those shallow drains and then and gypsum. So that's my summary on PA for drains, and probably got plenty of time for questions, Craig.